Outlining the moon is really easy and quite relaxing actually, because we're going to do the whipped back stitch, which if you go back a little bit when we were talking back here, the whole whipped back stitch, split stitch, whipped back stitch tutorial. So the whipped back stitch is at the very end of that little short tutorial. So if you didn't get a chance to watch that, I would definitely say go watch that now. And I am using 3 strands of this solid green DMC 906, and I've already done the back stitch, and just like I said in the tutorial, it doesn't look too bad. You could leave it like that, but I really wanted it to look a little more finished and to be smoother and have a little bit more weight. That's one reason I'm using 3 strands instead of 2. Have been using 2 strands so far. But so that's all there is to it, is just back stitch all the way around and then do your whipped back stitch. I've mentioned how relaxing it is. To be honest, I had started up here at this corner and I worked all the way around here to this corner and I came back all the way. When I got to about right here, honestly, I just zoned out for this whole section. I mean, I was still stitching, but I had just my mind had just sort of gone quiet, and it was actually very nice to have a little break, just to do something I didn't have to think about and just do it over and over and over. It was really very pleasant. So that's why I always say embroidery is very meditative. But same thing with this. It's so simple and you just don't have to think about it a lot. The only thing when you're doing this much whipped back stitch is that because you're doing the same motion over and over and over, the needle does tend to twist a little bit every time you put it in and go around. So this is definitely a stitch where it helps to about every, I'm finding I'm doing it about every 7 or 8 or 10 stitches, is to let that thread hang again. Hold up the hoop and let the thread hang from the back or the front or whatever, and that needle will really twist on you. It'll untwist, and let it go till it stops twisting, because this just really gets that thread twisted up. Other than that, very straightforward and is a really nice finish for this moon. And even though I said it's a nice finish for this moon, we're not 100% finished with the whole moon, because we still have these little bits in here and these little dots up at here at the top, the 2 points of the crescent. But for those, I'm going to wait and do those at the end after I've finished all my other stitching, because what we're going to do there can kind of snag on your other stitching, and so it's better to just leave, I think it's going to be beads, so it's better to just leave that until the end, till you finished all your other stitching, so your thread doesn't keep getting caught in those beads the whole time you're stitching. So we're going to do those at the very, very end. When it came time to decide what stitch to use for the crystals on this design, I knew that I wanted a stitch that had some weight to it, because these are the centerpiece of this design. Obviously, they're very colorful, and speaking of color, I knew I wanted something that would really show off the lovely color in these variegated threads. And the answer to what I was trying to figure out is the chain stitch. So that's what we're doing for this. And so now let me show you a tutorial about chain stitch and the 2 ways that you can achieve that stitch. The chain stitch is another one of those very versatile stitches that can be used for beautiful lines. It's wonderful for curves, and if you're doing any kind of script lettering like this, it works really well for that, because it has a nice compact line, but it has some texture to it. But it can also be used as a filling stitch, as it has been done here. It is filling in these petals, going around just rows of lines filling in these petals. So you can see it has a lot of uses, and there are 2 ways to create the chain stitch. I have 2 lines here that look very similar. The colors may look a little bit different, but that's just simply because I'm using a variegated thread. But these, although they look very similar, they were created in different ways. And the top line was made using what I call traditional chain stitch. And if you have seen my video about the daisy stitch, I kind of referred to it as a detached, sometimes it's also called a detached chain stitch because a chain stitch is made up of a row of connected daisy stitches, if you want to look at it that way. So let me show you how to create the traditional chain stitch. To begin, we are going to basically create a daisy stitch. So if you know how to do that, you come up at one point and you go down at the exact same point where that thread came up. And then you hold a loop open and you come up inside that loop one stitch length ahead and you pull that thread until you create your first stitch. For a daisy stitch, the next thing you would do is you would put a little anchoring stitch right there and pull the thread to the back. But we're not going to do that here. We are just going to begin that same motion again, and where that thread came up, we're going to go down in the exact same place. Hold a loop open. Move up a stitch length and pull that thread. And that is all there is to it for the traditional chain stitch. Follow your line, making a series of daisy stitches. You can make them shorter or longer depending on your design. It'll give you a little bit of a different look depending on how tightly you pull them and how long you make each one. And then to finish your line of chain stitch, traditional chain stitch, just as with the daisy stitch, now you just take your thread down to the back to anchor that last stitch. So there is the traditional chain stitch. The second method for creating a chain stitch is called the reverse chain stitch. And the first thing you're going to notice is that we're going to start at the opposite end of the line where we started here. And the first thing to do is to make a very tiny anchoring stitch. Just like that. Okay, so that's the first thing to do. Now you're going to come down a stitch length and put that needle underneath your little bitty anchoring stitch, pull it through, and now go down where that thread came out. And there's your first stitch. Now we're going to go down a stitch length, put that needle underneath the first stitch, pull it through, and put the needle down. So you can probably see now why it's called the reverse chain stitch. You're working in the opposite direction of the way the first one was created, but the effect ends up looking very similar or the same. You're making little loops that, go underneath the stitch ahead of it. Now, some people, my go-to is the traditional chain stitch. I don't know, I'm just used to it. And I feel like I get a little bit more of an even tension sometimes when I am doing the traditional versus the reverse. But many, many people love the reverse, and in a way it is more simple because you're not having to deal with that loop that you hold open, and sometimes the thread tension is better, easier to maintain on the reverse. So it is completely your preference about which one you use. Now I will say there are some times when the reverse chain stitch is a little bit more difficult, and not difficult in as far as doing the actual stitch, but just because of the situation you're in. For instance, here we were doing just simple lines. There's no stitching on either side. We just had fabric. There's no stitching up close to it, and it was very simple to get that needle up under. You can slide that needle underneath that stitch and you're not going to run into any other stitching or anything nearby. But if you are doing a filling stitch like this, where these stitches are very close together, these rows of chain stitches are very close together, sometimes it works fine. You can do the reverse chain stitch and you can get that needle. Let me just show you. I mean, I know this is already finished, but for instance, you know, you're trying to get that needle, let me turn it around this way. You're trying to get that needle, you know, under this stitch and stay out of the way of the one that's next to it. It can definitely be done. Sometimes it's just a little more tedious to avoid running your needle underneath or through stitches nearby. So that's really just one consideration about using traditional or reverse. If you're trying to do, you know, fill in a space like this, sometimes the traditional is easier because you're not moving your needle across the fabric. It all just comes out of the fabric up and down. So other than that though, it's totally your choice. Just try both and see which one you're more comfortable with and which one you like better, and choose that one. There are no wrong choices here. So I hope you have enjoyed this very quick tutorial about the very versatile chain stitch. Back now to our design, and I have chosen for the crystals to do reverse chain stitch. And don't freak out, you do not have to rotate your computer screen. It has not rotated on its own. I have simply turned my hoop around so that I can work in the direction starting from here to the end of the crystal this way, so I can do my reverse chain stitches towards me. The reason I made that choice is because I thought ahead, and when it comes down here to the point of the crystal, I wanted to get a nice crisp point on it like this. And I knew that if I had started here and worked around and come down here and done this and then changed directions, that this point is going to be softer. The only thing about this chain stitch when it comes to corners where, you know, lines change direction, is that it doesn't always give you a super crisp 90, you know, like a really sharp point. So I knew I wanted to end all of these lines that are going up the crystal right here so that I could, you know, put the needle down and have all of these lines come to a nice sharp point. So that's my long extended description about why I'm working upside down. You just do whatever feels comfortable for you. So since we are doing reverse chain stitch for this, the reason I chose reverse chain stitch, it's like I said in the other video, my go-to is usually traditional, and traditional chain stitch would absolutely have worked on this, but I thought I would challenge myself to do something different than I would normally do right off the bat, and to do reverse chain stitch. It works very well here because, as I mentioned in that video, there's not a lot of, you know, close-up stitching right next to these lines where I'm trying to work, so it's very easy to get that needle underneath, you know, even here when you're working here, even though that line is next to it, you can just push up on the fabric. So let's start down here, and the only little bitty tricky part is getting that first teeny tiny anchoring stitch underneath there, and I want it to be kind of under this line of the moon. I'm going to zoom in so that you can see a little better. Also, I chose to use my crystal needle minder today. I figured that was appropriate, right? Working on crystals. So let me get under here, and I'm going to make that first little anchoring stitch. In fact, I'm going to try to almost pull that line of the moon, and I'm going to make a tiny, tiny, tiny anchoring stitch right there. And I really want that stitch to be kind of buried under that line. And why do I want a tiny line? Because if I made, you know, a line that's as long as one of these chain stitches, I'm just going to have a line there. It's not going to be a teardrop shaped loop. It's going to be a line. And I really want the chain stitching, the line. In fact, these are a little bit further out than I wanted them. So now I have that teensy weensy little bitty line. But now I'm going to come down a stitch length and fish around to get under that little bitty line. Now, this is the only thing that I find with reverse chain stitch that I do have to fiddle with. Sometimes on that very first that little bitty anchoring stitch, when you pull the thread through it, it kind of pulls that anchoring stitch loose. So what I'm doing on the back is I am pinching that knot where I started. I'm holding it so that now as I'm pulling this, let me go back there and find it. Yeah, there it is. So that now when I pull this, I don't pull that anchoring stitch loose. And so there's my first stitch. My default, well, see I pulled it. I pulled this second stitch and it kind of yanked that anchoring stitch a little bit longer. I'm going to see if I can pull it back a little bit. That may or may not bug you, but it kind of bothers me. All right, so what was I saying? My default length for chain stitching, whether I'm doing traditional or reverse, tends to be very short. I like little small chain stitches. So even when I sometimes try to make them a little bit longer, I tend to just always, they go back to being small. That's just me. I'm not saying if yours are longer than this that they're wrong. Like for this one, I would really just say whatever you end up doing, just be consistent. Like I don't know that I would want to have one line of these little small stitches and then a line right next to it of like every stitch is 1/4 of an inch long. Really just be consistent. But find out what your comfort zone is and then you're good. So I'm going to keep doing these lines in reverse chain stitch and show you what it looks like when I get more of it done. And here are the crystals all finished. And I think you can see how really nice the variegated thread looks with a stitch like the chain stitch like it's used here. You know, variegated thread is beautiful and I love it, but one of the most common questions about it is how do I use it? I don't know really how to deal with all those different colors in random places. And this is a good example of line work being a really good application for that, especially when there's a lot of contrast between the bright green background and these lines. But the chain stitch in particular here, I think it shows it off really well because you really get to see the change in colors and it's really a nice contrast. So I hope you enjoyed stitching the crystals with these variegated threads.